Thanks, Annette, for that kind introduction. And I would just like to acknowledge that I'm sitting on the land of the Jagera and Turrbal people. I'm Emeritus Professor at the University of Queensland and a Professorial Fellow in the Institute for Learning Sciences and Teacher Education at Australian Catholic University. I've entitled the talk, Evidence to Inform Policy, Re-Out-of-Field Teaching, a Provocation. And there are the two questions to frame this session and which will lead on to subsequent discussion. What evidence is needed to inform policies? And that's what I will focus on. The second question, what government responses are occurring and what else is needed? I'm hoping my colleagues, Penny from the Victorian Department and Janine from Western Australia, might take that point up. So what evidence do we need to inform policy? Of two types, I would say, research evidence and Anna's book published this year. And I'm going to draw on Sue Thompson's work at ACER reporting on the recent IEA TIMS study. So we need research evidence, but we also importantly need systemic data. That is about the current situation of out-of-school, out-of-field teaching. We need demographic and enrolment predictions, future teacher demand predictions, including in specific subject areas, and so on. But I always make this point very strongly that we can only ever have and only ever should have evidence-informed policy, not evidence-based, because all policy is an admixture of facts. That is the data, the research, the evidence that I'm going to deal with, ideology, that is politics, discourses. And I would say to do something in this out-of-field teaching area, we need a commitment to every student in every classroom in every school in Australia having an expert teacher and professional knowledges, of course. Naming a domain is central to policies being developed. Domestic violence is a good case here. So I think out-of-field teaching has now been named. What we need now is the construction of systemic policies, and these are of an aspirational kind and of a pragmatic kind. In terms of the aspiration, I think we should set an ideal. Every child in every school taught by a teacher with appropriate pedagogical content knowledge, PCK, Schulman's notion, the conjoining of subject or discipline knowledge with pedagogical knowledge, an expert teacher. But we also need policies in this domain that deal with the realpolitik, the pragmatics. That is, we have many teachers currently teaching out of field. And what are the appropriate and necessary systemic policies here? PD policies, for example. And I would argue very strongly, we can't just look at policies focused on out-of-field teaching. We need to think of a whole policy ecology or assemblage, long-term planning, teacher recruitment, retention, ongoing PD, and so on. So let's just look at the research evidence. And I thought just as one base, and you all probably are familiar with this, the IEA, their TIMS study, it's been conducted since 1995, conducted every 4 years, tests maths and science for students in years 4 and year 8. The most recent was 2019, and ACER, Sue Thompson reported on this in 2021, earlier this year. The IEA test TIMS, Trends in International Maths and Science Study, different from PISA. TIMS is curriculum-based and year-level based. PISA, in contrast, is the application of knowledge and it's age-based, 15-year-olds. So if we look at the 2019 TIMS data, and I would point you in the direction of the report I've got as the bottom dot point here, the Sue Thompson ACER report. So in the data for 2019, a sample of about 14,500, a representative sample of Australian school students, almost 1 in 4 year 8 students have a teacher unqualified in maths. The data, that TIMS data, show very strongly the achievement differences between those taught by expert maths teachers and those taught by out-of-field teachers. The data also show that out-of-field teachers are much more likely to be in schools serving low socioeconomic students. And there's an accumulative effect here, the way SES disadvantage works with out-of-field teaching. They say in that report, the TIMS data show disadvantaged students are concentrated, the brunt of it's borne by disadvantaged students out of field teaching. The data also show that out of field maths teachers are less experienced than those who have been trained, educated as math teachers, expert teachers, and perhaps that's a factor in teacher retention. The Australian Mathematical Science Institute warned that recently that 76% of students will be taught by an out of field maths teacher in the first 4 years of secondary school. 35% will be taught twice in those 4 years, and 8% will be taught by an out of field maths teacher across the whole 4 years. So we need, yes, the aspirational policy, but we need a pragmatic one. And given future projected shortages, we need to think about the provision of professional development at a systemic level, I would argue, and focusing on the pedagogical and the discipline, pedagogical content knowledge. And it's not just STEM, but we know that the federal government has committed 9.5 million to develop professional learning materials in the domains of maths and numeracy. So just to reiterate, and I have not put any references here because the evidence here is overwhelming, that out of all of the in-school factors, teacher pedagogy has the biggest impact on student learning. But that's a two-edged sword, of course, if we only focus on teachers. My position's different from John Hattie's, who says, look, poverty has more impact, but we can't deal with it in schools. I think we can at a systemic level through redistributive policy and policies which enable schools and communities in schools. But teacher pedagogy is very important. And this is why we need to focus on and have policies on out-of-field teachers. And we know the evidence is that a minimum of threshold knowledge is needed to be able to effectively teach. I have been reading the Sydney Morning Herald recently, and on the 8th of this month, they reported a Department of Education report which said 100,000 teachers in New South Wales were being taught in maths, science, English and history by a teacher who was teaching out of field. There's links, and this is nuanced, there are links also to the quality of HSC results. So 22% of year 7 to year 10 maths teachers out of field, 12% for year 11 and 12, and 20% of junior English and history. There's a quote I have there from the head of the Principals Association saying now this is widespread, but there's the equity matter there in rural, remote areas, then in disadvantaged areas, and now all schools. We need systemic data, the future enrolment boom, and all of the implications for staffing that flow from that. Future demographic predictions. I would argue, each system requires a 10-year workforce plan and strategies to achieve it. And I wonder whether all of the systems have the data on out-of-field teaching. So there's a policy ecology here, a whole range of complementary policies that are required. Now, policy, in terms of developing policy, I always think the old David Easton political science definition of policy as the authoritative allocation of values is very important here. And I think we need a policy, and I think we need pressure from professional associations, researchers, academic people in the policy-making game, the teacher unions, that we have as one of our principles, and perhaps this could be articulated in the next set of national goals following on from the Alice Springs Declaration. Every child has a right to be taught by an expert teacher. So we need systemic policy about this, the aspirational, but also we need the pragmatic, as I've mentioned, and also we need to put as much emphasis on implementation, enactment, as developing the policy, so it simply doesn't sit there as a symbolic policy. Perhaps this raises the issue, which I won't go into here, and big debates about this, of the issue of subject specialists in primary schools. The policy enactment at the school level is significant here, and I think the development of the policy that I'm arguing will be necessary. I think we need teacher voices there through their representative bodies, unions, professional associations. Researchers should be there as well. If we come to PD, I think there's a way in which the move to devolve things to schools under the rubric of school autonomy and one-line budgets. And teachers have to do continuing PD to keep their registration. But I think in this domain, we need a systemic policy framework to address the issue of out-of-field teaching. And the policy has to be framed in terms of research, data as evidence-informed policy, and the enactment in school, but teacher voice needs to be involved in the development of the policy. So whose problem is out-of-field teaching? Well, I'd say it's the departments. There needs to be an acknowledgement of the issue and policy responses linked to this broader policy ecology I've mentioned. We need to be very, very careful in not blaming out-of-field teachers. And the naming's significant here. I think expert out-of-field is perhaps a good way of naming. For whom is out-of-field teaching a problem? Well, out-of-field teachers who need the PD. Anna's research says 3 to 5 years to come up to speed, so it needs to be a long-term program. And it's a problem for teachers, particularly given we've got this top-down test-based mode of accountability where teachers are held responsible for the test scores of students they teach. And developments in that direction, like value-added models, as in Texas and the US, also hone in on focus on the teacher and cause problems here. It's a problem for students, particularly those in schools serving disadvantaged communities. I think we need to think about the equity and quality aspirations of the Alice Springs Declaration, given the concentration of out-of-field teachers in disadvantaged schools. This is a problem at school level as well as systemic in terms of staffing and how principals function in relation to this. So I would say the problem has been named. So that's the first step. We now need systemic policy, aspirational, pragmatic. We need for research and ongoing research. And I think Anna's research has been important here. Her book is a really important contribution to research about out-of-field teaching and its impact. And we need data at the systemic level to inform policy, but also real commitments to implementation. Thank you.